Hello, everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you today on WJOPLP Newburyport at FM 96.3 on Channel 9 and will be available on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm just delighted this morning to welcome Peter Muise here. He is the author of Legends and Lore of the North Shore. He was born in Haverhill, Massachusetts, and lives his entire life in New England. He has degrees in anthropology from Bates College and Brandeis University. Local folklore has been his passion for more than 20 years. And in addition to being the author of Legends and Lore of the North Shore, he's also the author of Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts, and he blogs at newenglandfolklore.blogspot.com. And he's here today to talk to us about Newburyport's own accused witch, Elizabeth Morse. So, Peter, first of all, welcome to the morning show, and thank you so much for taking time to be with us this morning.
Oh, thank you for having me, Mary. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, it's totally my pleasure. Now, I want to start by talking about how I became aware that Newburyport had an accused witch from the 17th century. And we'll note that Newburyport was then, of course, Newbury, because they hadn't split yet. And let's show the photograph we have, Maeve, of the plaque that's at the corner of Liberty Street and State Street in downtown Newburyport on the wall of Market Square Jewelers, that I had walked by many, many times without ever noticing it there. Once it was drawn to my attention, though, my jaw dropped and I said, "What on earth? Who knew that Newburyport had its own accused witch?" And for the sake of people who might be listening on the radio, I'm going to read what the plaque says. Mrs. Elizabeth Morse, Witch of Newbury, 1679 to 1681, arrested, tried, imprisoned, and reprieved, confined to her husband William Morse's 4-acre house lot on the southeast side of Market Square until her death. And this plaque was put in place by the Morse Society in 1999. And I understand the Morse Society is a group that is dedicated to researching and commemorating people named Morse, sensibly enough. So that's how the plaque came to be there and who put it there. And her story, as it turns out, is quite fascinating and sad, with lots of twists and turns and family dynamics. But before we get into that, Peter, I was hoping that you could talk a bit about some of the Puritan context for how they viewed witchcraft, because you do it in your book so clearly and concisely.
Sure.
Talk to us about the theological underpinnings of the Puritans' belief in witchcraft and magic and why they viewed it as always necessarily evil.
Sure. So the Puritans, as you know, were sort of a religious movement breaking away from the Church of England. Many of them came to New England to sort of set up their own, basically theocratic state, right? Mm-hmm. And not everyone who came to New England in the 1600s was a Puritan, but many people were Puritans, and they were sort of the dominant force. And so I think they founded Newbury in, let's say, 1635, I think, was when
Sounds
they came.
Sounds about right, yeah.
Right? So one of the underpinnings of the Puritan theology is that they believe they were on the side of God. They were on God's side. And if you were not a Puritan, well, you were on the devil's side. So you see that play out sort of in
bifurcated.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So you see that play out sort of in the politics in the era, like the French Canadians who are Catholic, clearly they're from the devil. Local Native Americans who did not convert, they're from the devil. Quakers, they're from the devil, right? Everybody who's not a Puritan is basically from the devil. So it's a very black and white worldview. And in that worldview, all the divine power, all the magical power flows from God, right? It comes just from God. So if someone is using magic and they're not God, they are therefore an adversary of God.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the Puritan theologian's viewpoint. I think the sort of man in the street or man in the farmyard type of Puritan may have had a slightly more blurry definition, because I think some Puritans did practice magic. Sea captains would consult astrologers to kind of learn when the best time was to sail. Young women might get their tea leaves read to find out who they would marry, things like that. And definitely some people also practiced magic that was designed to combat witches. So you do see that
Okay.
like sort of defensive magic, and we'll talk about it a little bit with Elizabeth
Yeah.
Morse, I think. But so it was this worldview where, for the Puritan theologians, the clergy, the hierarchy, like anyone who practiced magic was bad, and therefore witchcraft was necessarily an evil thing. The
Hmm.
Puritans, I think you think if we can think about witchcraft as a way that they would explain away misfortunes that would come to them,
Yeah.
is one way to think about it. So if this is a pre-Enlightenment era. These people are basically it's a late Renaissance time frame. So I like to say like some of these Puritans who came to settle Newbury could have seen Shakespeare's plays when they first were performed, right?
Oh, wow. That's amazing to think of that.
So
Wow.
think of it that way,
Yeah.
right? So it's a different worldview. It's not the
Yeah.
Enlightenment of Ben Franklin and
Right.
Descartes. It's like Shakespeare, Henry VIII. This is like an older mindset
Yeah.
when they came over. And so, where was I going with this? But anyway,
Well, I think I know where you were going, and it fits in with another thing I wanted to ask you about, and that had to do with it has to do with the black-white thinking. Another way of
yeah,
talking about it, there's a very rigid kind of morality, and a lot of very strict, and one might fairly say constraining rules and
yes,
expectations for rules and behavioral norms. A lot of expectation of
and
conformity.
yes, and also I think because these Puritan settlements were very small. Like these are
Yeah,
like Newburyport is now a big city.
yeah,
Newbury, these are the big areas. At the time, it was a very small community. They were on an entirely new continent, and so everyone was very interdependent on each other. And there was a pressure to maintain like a nice, calm facade, maintain social peace, and maintain social norms. Right? Everyone had to work together because you're just interdependent with each other. You could not get
yeah,
along without each other. And so there is this idea that anyone who disrupts that social equilibrium is kind of suspect. And particularly people who are argumentative or people who ask too much from their neighbors, these were the people who would often be accused of witchcraft, particularly women, I think, who had particularly
yeah,
rigid rules about their behavior, more rigid than men, like an argumentative woman, oof, like that
yeah.
often. And so then when the misfortune starts to happen, like your crops fail, your cow gets sick, your butter doesn't churn properly, you're like, how come my butter didn't churn properly? It churned properly last week. But isn't it strange? I had an argument with Elizabeth Morse, and now
Mhm.
after that, my butter's not churning. Like, I think perhaps she might have bewitched it, right? So it's a way of blaming everyday misfortunes on a person and putting supernatural blame on an individual person, right?
Yeah, and it's really interesting, Peter. What strikes me as you describe it is that there are always going to be misfortunes happening.
Yes.
People die, people get sick, the milk goes bad. Um, and and yet, when the expectation is that things are supposed to go in a certain rigid way. And there's not a lot of room for gray, and there's not a lot of tolerance of ambiguity or flexibility, then the need arises to find some reassuring way to explain, even if it's a somewhat scary way of explaining it, like there
Right.
are witches, but there needs to be an explanation. There has to be a reason for it in order to allay fair enough to say a certain amount of paranoid anxiety. I think that's the phrase that comes to my mind anyway. And so one way to deal with that anxiety is to find someone to blame. And it's going to be in a small Puritan village, um, one of your neighbors.
One of your
Um,
neighbors, the neighbor that you don't like, right?
yes,
The neighbor that
right,
you don't like is the one who's going to
right,
be the witch usually.
right.
And it's interesting. If you look at the witch trials in Europe, you see witch trials in Scotland, England, France, Germany, all these places. There were very few witchcraft trials in Ireland because
Hmm.
in Ireland, people blame their misfortune on the fairies. So your
Oh,
butter doesn't
okay.
churn. Oh, it was that fairy. I should have, left out something for the fairies at night. Or my cow got sick. The fairies charmed it. But the Puritans who came to New England came from a part of England called East Anglia, which is
Uh-huh.
where a lot of witchcraft trials came from. They didn't have a lot of fairy belief in Anglia, but they had a lot of witchcraft belief. So they
Oh,
bring those
that's
witchcraft beliefs over with them. So you're like, oh, what's the misfortune? It's a witch, not a fairy here.
Oh, that is just fascinating, Peter. That's really intriguing. So, if you could externalize your anxiety and your fear and your need to blame something for a misfortune, and you had a belief that there were supernatural extra human beings, then you can enlist the fairies and hold them accountable.
Right. But
But
in the right, but in the Puritans, you're conflating the supernatural being and your neighbor.
yes,
Like
that's
they're the
right.
same thing. Your neighbor is a supernatural being.
Right. That's really fascinating. Well, speaking of supernatural beings, then let's talk about their powers. What powers were witches believed to have by the Puritans, and what methods did they think they were able to use to exercise those powers?
Right. So the witches were believed to they worked evil magic, right? Malefic magic is what they worked. So as we said, misfortunes, sickness, they make ships sink, people drown, crops fail, animals get sick, babies die. Like these are the things you see witches blamed for. Some of these, now the Puritan clergy felt that these powers were given to witches by the devil, right? A witch
Hmm.
would sign their name in the devil's book and they would become a witch that way. The average Puritan didn't necessarily have that belief that all witchcraft came from the devil, but they thought witches just maybe were born that way or just were bad people somehow.
Hmm.
But witches could work their magic through what they call puppets, which is like an image or a doll of a person, and they stab it with a nail or they tie a string around its neck and then you're choking at night and things like that. Sort of what people now mistakenly call a voodoo doll, but
Yeah.
really that's a misnomer. It's been around for a long, long time. You see it all over Europe. It's what they call a poppet. And in some of the Salem witch trials, they would produce alleged poppets that they found as evidence. Look, we found this poppet in somebody's house. Um, that's one way. I think the main way you see witches causing trouble is they send out their specter or their soul out of their body.
Hmm.
And it's sort of like an astral double that comes out of their body and it will come and it will just do bad things. Like it'll show up in your sleep. It will suffocate you as you sleep, right? It might show up in your dreams and torment you in your dreams. And that specter can also inhabit an animal and make the animal misbehave. And so you see sometimes in these witchcraft stories, a farmer's pig, for example, is misbehaving and is like spinning around or it seems sick or whatever. And he thinks, oh, this pig was fine yesterday. It must be bewitched. He will then do something to hurt the pig, like cut off its ear, right? Or cut off its tail with the belief that the witch's soul is inside that pig. So by hurting the pig, he's hurting the witch's soul. And then the next day, the stories will say, oh, that cranky old woman down the street, she had a bandage over her ear because her ear got cut off and she couldn't explain how it happened. And you see that with Elizabeth Morse, where one of her neighbors is riding his horse across a field and he's attacked by a mysterious cat. And it's not clear if this is like a wild cat, like a bobcat, or if it's just like a giant house cat, but he's attacked by this cat, which is clawing at his leg. And he manages to like beat it off. He kicks it away and he kicks it really hard in the head and it runs off. And then the next day, Elizabeth Morse, his husband's like, oh, my wife is really sick today. She has a really terrible headache. And this neighbor's like, oh, I know what this is. She was the cat, right? And of course, you could have a headache for a lot of reasons.
That's right. Yeah.
But he adds up to 2 and 2 to make, 5 in his brain there.
The juxtaposition of the two incidents, though, becomes proof of,
Right.
Of witchcraft. That's really fascinating, Peter. Well, let's talk about Elizabeth Morse. There are family dynamics involved in her story that are really interesting. Could you first talk about who was living in her household in 1679?
Sure. So it's William Morse, who was a shoemaker. And when he's a shoemaker, but he wouldn't be a full-time shoemaker because there just aren't enough people. So they're also farming, right? Farming raising. So William Morse, his wife Elizabeth Morse, and they're older folks. They're in their 60s. I think they're at least 65, if not older. And with them is living their adolescent grandson, John Stiles. And I haven't been able to find out what happened to his mother and father, why the grandson is living with them. But that was sort of common to have multi-generational families and, apprentices, adoptees, things like that with these families. So he's living with Elizabeth and William, this John Stiles. And if you read the accounts, he's a troublemaker. Like John Stiles is a troublemaker. And you see in the fall of 1679, William and Elizabeth are starting to have these strange phenomena happening in their house, right? Things are getting knocked off shelves. William is praying with like a cloth over his head, like a shawl over his head, and some unseen entity throws a shoe at him and whacks him in the back of the head, right? Stones are thrown down the chimney. They wake up in the middle of the night. There's a pig running around in their kitchen. And they think, oh, this is all supernatural. They think perhaps a witch is bewitching their house. one of their neighbors is a man named Caleb Powell. Caleb
Mhm.
Powell is a sailor. He's friends with William Morse. He has walked by their house and looked in the window, and he has seen John Stiles throwing things at his grandfather, right? Like Caleb Powell, like John Stiles is causing this. If you, and he says to William and Elizabeth, if you let me take John to live with me, I think all the witchcraft will stop in your
Yeah,
house.
yeah.
Caleb Powell takes this John Stiles to live with him, and all the witchcraft stops in William's
Okay.
house. But oddly, they are not relieved. They should be like, oh, great, it was just our bratty grandson causing
Yeah.
trouble. But instead, they think, oh, Caleb Powell is a witch.
Yeah, okay.
Caleb
Yeah.
Powell had been bewitching us, and this is really all his doing. So they accuse him of being a witch, and he's put on trial. So Elizabeth and William bring up charges against Caleb Powell, and he's brought to court. And he testifies that he saw John Stiles throwing things at his grandfather, and that John Stiles was basically, the troubled adolescent who was acting out. But neighbors testify against Caleb Powell that he basically knew some magic. He
Hmm.
knew astrology, and one person testified he doesn't only know astrology, he knows astronomy too, right? Like this
Oh
is a big
no.
astronomy, right? Which makes sense because he's a sailor, right? Sailors would need to know some
Right.
history.
Yeah.
And other people say, oh, Caleb Powell was brought up by a wizard in Gloucester named Francis Norwood. Like, so, and Caleb Powell had told other people he understood the working of spirits. So maybe he did dabble in
Okay.
magic. The court eventually finds Caleb Powell innocent of bewitching the
Mhm.
Morses. They say, no, he did not bewitch them, but they are still not quite satisfied that he is not a magician, so they fine him. Like, he has to pay all the
Mhm.
court fees. They're like,
Mhm.
you didn't bewitch them, but you're still a shady character, so we're going to fine you.
Yeah.
So you would think this would be the end of the story, but it's not, because Elizabeth Morse's neighbors then accuse her of being a witch. And 17 or 18 people testify against her, these written
Wow.
testimonies, which you can find in Joshua Coffin's History of Newbury, has
Uh-huh.
huge citations of these testimonies in the
Wow.
original language, if anyone's
Uh-huh.
curious, and you can find it online.
Uh-huh.
And so 17 or 18 people just testify against Elizabeth about all the horrible things that happened, usually after they had a fight with Elizabeth.
Mhm.
So it is like,
Okay.
we fought over a property boundary, and then my best cow spun around in a circle, foaming at the mouth and died,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
My favorite sheep sat on its hind legs and bellowed like a goat and then died.
Mhm.
A lot of that sort of stuff, that livestock died after they fought with Elizabeth. And you get the impression that Elizabeth just was not a popular person. She was perhaps outspoken, grumpy, cantankerous, whatever, and people were connecting their misfortunes to her.
And they
And
had the opportunity because Caleb Powell, they decided, was not the source of the strange
right,
happenings, although he got
right,
fined anyway for being a sketchy character by their definition. And so there
right.
was still an open question
Of
about,
who? Yeah.
yeah, how did these strange, who's responsible? And
Who's responsible?
ironically, the Morses could have had an end of it, when Caleb Powell took John Stiles away. But instead of allowing it to end, they went ahead and used their own suspicions, or perhaps, were reluctant to think that their grandson was beyond a prankster, was just
Right,
kind of, beyond mischief, sketchy himself in some
right,
ways. And so they participated in this really fascinating chain of circumstances that wound up with Elizabeth Morse being accused of witchcraft by many of her neighbors then, who I guess used their grievances against her, or the critique of her personality or past kind of frustrations and irritations with her. They turned into then her being seen as responsible for the strange happenings, the witchcraft in her house. So it's such an odd story. There's so much irony in it,
right. Perhaps
Peter.
if Elizabeth and William had just let it go, it never would have
Yes,
happened. But they
that's
did.
right.
Right?
But
They
they
did.
didn't. And so there's a psychological portrait there as well, as the history of the Puritans and how they dealt with anxiety and grievances. But so what happens after that? She goes on trial.
She goes on
Um,
trial. All these people testify against her. She is found guilty
Yeah.
by the court and she is sentenced to be hanged,
Yeah.
which is, of course, awful, right?
Yeah.
No matter how grumpy you are, you don't deserve to be hanged for being a
Yeah.
grumpy person,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
And there is a reprieve. So there's sort of a lower court, and then I think because it's a capital crime, it's bumped up to the Court of Assistance, which is like the House of Representatives, basically.
Okay.
So it's bumped up to a higher level, and they hear the testimony and they say, no, we're not going to execute her.
Hmm.
And she is then confined to her house and she dies, maybe, I think a few years after, like 2 or 3 years after
Hmm.
that. So it's a sad story for her. It's
Yeah.
interesting. At the time when it happened, I haven't seen any records that say exactly why the sort of Court of Assistance or the governor said we are reprieving these findings.
Yeah.
But John Hale, who was a reverend who wrote after the Salem witch trials in, like, I think his book came out like 1695 or something, about all sorts of witchcraft in Massachusetts, he says they didn't believe the evidence. It
Hmm.
was entirely believable. And they also were suspicious of people who had seen Elizabeth Morse's specter. So a lot of people said, oh, I saw her specter do this, or her specter came in my room at night, or her specter, specter, specter,
Hmm.
specter. I've been seeing
Yeah.
her specter flying around doing these things. And although this Court of Assistance, this higher level court, believed in witches and believed that witches could send out their specter, they said there was no way to prove that that specter was really Elizabeth Morse's. Like someone could
Oh.
have changed their appearance to appear like her
Hmm.
just to cause trouble, right? Or maybe somebody else was the witch and they were disguised as Elizabeth Morse to do these
Hmm.
things. They're like, it's not conclusive enough evidence to execute this person. And sadly, when you get to the Salem witch trials, though, um, they are taking spectral evidence on its face value. So
Hmm.
if you saw my specter in a dream and had a nightmare about me, like, oh, that was Peter Muise doing it. Like
Okay.
no
Yeah.
one else was faking it; it was him. Um,
Okay.
so
Um,
where other reverends, other ministers, are like, well, the devil can take many forms. It could have been the devil in the shape of
mhm.
Elizabeth or Peter Muise, but um,
Well, it sounds like Elizabeth Morse got lucky in the members of that court then who were skeptical enough, not that specters weren't possible, but that it was her specter, because it could have been somebody else's specter, um, making her seem like the guilty party. That's really
right.
interesting. God help us with the legal system. But it worked out well for
Yeah,
Elizabeth Morse in the end,
and
anyway.
it's
So,
it's interesting. I think these Puritan ministers and things often were better educated than the average person.
mm,
So they often, at least for a time, were applying more strict rules of evidence than the common farmer or the common sailor,
interesting.
something like that, because they
Yeah.
did have a higher level of education. So they were thinking, is this quite correct? Like, and they were trying to also
Yeah.
not just be executing people willy nilly. I mean, there had been
Yeah.
five women were executed before the Salem witch trials in
Hmm.
Massachusetts. So Elizabeth Morse could have been number six,
Yeah.
but luckily she wasn't. But most witchcraft trials before Salem were small affairs, one person. People tended to be found innocent.
Hmm.
Um, Maybe they were fined. You could even
Hmm.
be fined for false accusations, like falsely accusing somebody
Oh,
of witchcraft. You'd be fined for that. So,
interesting. Well, I'm curious as I was reading about Elizabeth Morse's experience and given what you're saying about the powers people believe witches had, which were large, great powers. I wondered whether, if was it ever argued by some accused witch in her defense that if they really had such supernatural powers, couldn't they be deployed then to escape prison? Or couldn't they send their specter to alter the judge's views? To your knowledge, was that ever used as a defense, saying, if I really had all these powers, why wouldn't I not be here in front of you facing these charges and the risk of being hanged?
um, maybe in the Salem witch trials, you see some people who are a few of the people accused, they were very sassy and were like,
Mhm.
this is ridiculous. It's not
Mm.
true. What, you do see it then. I think a lot of people accused of witchcraft believed in witches, though,
Okay.
themselves. So it
All
was not
right.
so much witchcraft is fake. It's like, I'm not the witch. Like, there are witches,
Okay,
but I'm not
right.
one of them. Right.
It's real,
Um,
but it's not me.
yeah, but it's not me. And there
Yeah.
was also this idea that if a witch was discovered or confessed, they could not work as much bad magic. right?
Oh, interesting.
That's what took
Okay.
away their powers. And if witch had iron handcuffs on, that would prevent them from doing magic as well. So often, when people, after people confess to being a witch, like all the witchcraft disappears because suddenly their powers are gone, right? It's like it's a big secret. And once the secret's out, like, oh, that's the end of it, type
So
of
that
thing.
would be a real inducement to confess to being guilty of being a witch because it might save your life.
Right. It's interesting. Like in the Salem witch trials, everyone who confessed to being guilty was saved.
Mhm.
Everyone who was hanged in the Salem witch trials pled innocent to the end.
Yeah.
But that's because that court in the Salem witch trials was really interested in finding as many witches as they could.
Hmm.
So if you confessed you're a witch and named other witches, you were saved.
Yeah.
And so people knew that when they were brought into that court.
Yeah.
So if I was brought into that court and like, we're going to hang you if you proclaim you're innocent, like, okay, well, I'm guilty. And you know who else is a witch? Mary Jacobsen. She's also a witch. So I would be fine. And then you'd be dragged into court and you'd be like, well, you could say you're innocent and be hanged, or you can accuse some other people and be saved. And so that's how you end up with like hundreds of people being accused in some witch trials. With the smaller trials, if Elizabeth Morse had pled guilty, she would have been hanged, I
Yeah.
think. They were
Gosh.
not looking for a vast
Yeah.
conspiracy, they were just looking for one witch then.
You know, Peter, I think I mentioned this to you in my notes preparing for the this interview, but it did remind me. There's an old Monty Python sketch, and I don't remember which movie it was in, but in the sketch they're talking about how are they going to figure out whether someone is a witch or not, and they said, well, you know, let's throw her in the lake. And if she drowns, she wasn't a witch. But if she floats, then she really is a witch and we have to hang her. So, in other words,
Right.
there was no good outcome. From our current perspective, post Enlightenment, these accusations sound absurd from our point of view. But nonetheless, the story is really sad and sobering and tragic. And Elizabeth Morse clearly could have lost her life. But for the court that said the evidence wasn't convincing enough to them that it was actually her specter. Um, and so, and you've talked about the contagious power of rumor, I guess is what we would call it. And if you suspected somebody or you didn't like something they'd done, you could literally demonize them in Puritan times, which helps to justify violence and a death sentence against them. And as you point out, just a decade after Elizabeth's trial, 14 women and 5 men were killed in the Salem witch trials. And one more man, Giles Corey, was killed while being questioned under torture. And of course, you've written about other witch trials in your other book, um, Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts. So I know that you thought about this a lot, as is clear from how the very well-informed, clear way that you talk about it. So I'm just curious, what do you think, Peter, as you've reflected on these stories, what do they tell us about human nature, past, but perhaps also present?
That's a tough question, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess I would say if you were going to look for supernatural explanations for misfortune, put it on the fairies, right? Put it on a ghost, put it on an alien, put it on Bigfoot, right? Put it on something that is a full supernatural being that's out there. Like, don't put it on your neighbor, I
Yeah.
think is the lesson you learn from this. And
Yeah.
that's what I would say. Like, it's fine to believe in the supernatural, but just don't say your neighbor is a witch and don't believe your neighbor is the cause of your supernatural problems.
Right. Um, look to externalize it onto something not human.
Right, exactly, exactly.
Something fanciful like a fairy. I think that is terrific advice, and I think it's advice that we would benefit from, these days. Of course, thinking about it, it was natural to think about the Haitian immigrants in Ohio, where the rumors were spread, and rumors are contagious, Peter. They spread and they take root in certain people who are I guess, willing to believe the worst of their neighbors. And so it is powerful to spread rumors. So all the more important to say, no, it's not immigrants, it's not your neighbors, it's the fairies.
Bigfoot ate that cat. Bigfoot eating
That's
people
right.
cat.
That's
Right?
right. We'd all be so much better off. I think that's really great advice. We should spread it. Um, Peter, what are you researching and writing about right now?
That's a good question. I'm leading a tour for some friends of Harvard Square in a few weeks. So I've just been looking at some of the stories from Harvard Square. Like, there were certainly witches in Cambridge as well, and some interesting ghost stories. And interestingly, there's also in the 19th century there was a movement of ghost stories that debunked ghost stories.
Oh,
So there's one of those in Harvard Square about a student who swore up and down he didn't believe in ghosts. He's like, I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in ghosts. And his roommates were like, "Oh, we're gonna show this guy, right? We're gonna play a trick on him." So one of them dressed up like a ghost and came into the room to terrify this skeptical student. And the skeptical student had a pistol which he kept under his bed. And he pulled it out and he shot at the ghost.
oh no.
But his roommates knew he had this pistol, so they had taken out the bullets and just left
Oh,
the gun.
oh,
So it makes this big explosion, but the ghost is unharmed. The skeptical student is just suddenly freaked out and terrified that he's actually seeing a real ghost, has a heart attack, and dies.
oh no. Oh my God. That's, we're laughing, but it for good reason, but it's a terrible story.
It's a terrible story. And I don't know if it's true, but that's the story. And the lesson is like, ghosts aren't real and don't play tricks on people. And that story comes from Washington Allston, who was a painter, he was a famous landscape painter. And actually, the neighborhood of Allston, Massachusetts is named after him.
Oh,
But he was a
that's
student at
right.
Harvard in like early 1800s, and this is a story he told.
Uh-huh. Oh, that will be a very fun tour. And will that make its way into another book, do you think, with other?
I don't know. I mean, I have been taking a little pause from my blog. I'll probably
Uh-huh.
be blogging about it shortly, so I'm going to
Yeah.
start the blog up again and put it on there, I think.
Okay. Well, I hope you do, because it's a terrific story. Well, Peter, thank you so much. It's really been fun and fascinating to talk to you, and to learn the history of Newburyport's own accused witch, Elizabeth Morse. And I'm hopeful now that people will go see the plaque. And now, if they do, instead of going, "What the heck? Why didn't I know this?" They'll say, "Yeah, I heard about it on the morning show. I know who she is, and this is where she lives." So, thank you so much for
Thank
taking
you. It
time to be on the show. I really appreciate it.
was great. Thank you.
So that's it for today, everybody. Farewell. Please join us again next Thursday at 9 for the morning show. Until then, take care. Bye bye.